On the road.
No more joke.
Well, welcome everyone to our Wednesday evening Practical Guild or Practical Theology Guild. I will get this out for McMaster Divinity College. Today we have Dr. Wendy Porter, and I'm going to read off my screen over here, who holds a PhD from the University of Surrey in the UK. She's an associate professor of music and worship at MDC. She teaches courses on music and worship, theological reflection, spiritual formation, and the history of worship and liturgy. She plans and leads worship in numerous settings, writes worship songs, and has recorded 3 vocal albums. She also has written and edited numerous academic volumes, including Religion and Sexuality and Rediscovering Worship, Past, Present, and Future. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Porter here with us today, and we thank her for being willing to share with us today. So Wendy, do you want to say something before we go into the questions, or
no? It's great to be here. I think most of you know who I am, and so you didn't need to hear all that. But anyways, that's great. I'm glad to do this, glad to be here. And I will just say what I had said to Dale at the beginning, and that is I got a lot of material. I can't get through it all, so we'll have to see how this works.
And I should have added the best teacher, prof at McMaster. So it's in my notes, and I forgot to read that part. So
right, no doubt.
Yeah,
no doubt.
So, Dr. Porter, share with us your personal experiences on getting your personal works published. What challenges and rewards were experienced in the process? And then I have A and B, but you can get into those yourself if you want.
Okay, all right, I will then. Okay, so I kind of just chose certain things that I thought were important to mention, and they maybe don't exactly answer the question, but I wanted to talk about moving from conference papers to publications, which is something I did a lot when I was doing my PhD. So I presented major papers at conferences regularly, probably at least one a year. And I was also invited to present the plenary paper at a scholarly conference in another part of England. We lived in London at the time. So there are lots of rewards of this. You asked, what were the challenges and rewards? The challenge was, of course, to write the paper. The rewards were multiple. One was that they were published. They were published in conference volumes. So I was getting experience in what it is like to have papers published. And that's a different experience in some cases. I learned early on, for instance, that when you're doing final proofreading, you don't get to change much. You really just got to go with whatever you got, right? Except for critical errors. Another reward of this is that when you sign up for a conference paper that has potential to be published, you've got a built-in deadline, and you really can't kind of fudge it. You can't say, oh, well, I think I'll, get it to you a week later. No, the conference is happening now. You're scheduled at, 1:30 or whatever it is. You got to give the paper. And so that deadline is really great for helping you to get your work done, focusing on research, and then the paper's already there and ready for publication. I'll say something more about that kind of process later. So I did a lot of conference papers, and I was able to explore a lot of different areas. I won't go through them all, but they're pretty wide ranging. And they just represent interests I had, or maybe that I was invited to do something. And so they weren't necessarily part of my dissertation work. They were just things I was interested in. I had an opportunity to research them. I didn't always know that much at the beginning, but by the time I was presenting my paper, I knew a lot. And so often they were areas that a lot of people weren't already discussing. And so that was kind of cool too. I did want to talk about some of the aspects of publishing a monograph with Routledge. So one of the things about getting work published. So this last year, a book came out. It's called, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but no, it's kind of going weirdo in the thing. It's called Early English Composers and the Credo, Emphasis as Interpretation in 16th Century Music. So I wanted to just mention some of the things about that process. This book is pretty serious scholarship. And it includes developing my own kind of a methodology that I could use to apply to music and text, because usually musicologists tend to just study music, and usually there's a little kind of a sideline or a footnote about some text. For me, I'm interested in the text. And so I developed a methodology that specifically allowed me to do that kind of level of work. So Routledge is one of the leading publishers that does high-level musical research publications. It also does lots of other academic areas. By now, it's one of the biggest publishers in the world. But it does musical research. They were really interested in this volume for that series, or a series that they had on this. But my manuscript was about 135,000 words. Now that's not considered massively long in some ways, and books used to be longer, but their upper level limit was 110,000 words. And so did I say, oh, no, sorry, I guess I can't publish it here? I said, no problem. I can take out 25,000 words. Now, if you've ever taken out, a few thousand words of something, it's a big deal to do. 25,000 words is basically the equivalent of an MDiv thesis. So it's a lot of writing and represented a lot of work, but I just systematically went through. And normally in the past, I would have said you can't take out that much by squeezing it out of every page, but I found out you can. So I went through the manuscript, and every sentence I made sure, did I have extra words? Take them out. Did I say something twice? Take one out. But I did also take out one entire chapter that was not as interesting, or I thought it wouldn't be. It was interesting to me, but probably not as good for selling a book. So I got this manuscript down to 110,000 words. So it was a big challenge, but obviously the reward was it's published. Here it is in published form. And so that's a great experience and a great experiment, really. And can you do this? In fact, yes, you can. So now I know you can cut out a lot more words than I'd realized. But I also got a lot of work that I've written, but I haven't yet published. And so for me right now, the challenge is putting aside time, finding time, forcing myself to have the time to actually to do something with it. I probably have enough material for 3 more books. And it's already written. I can show a stack of pages, that it's there. So now I need to do the work to do that. And you all know what that's like, to have stuff ready to be ready to be done, but you got to do the work. So part of the question was going to be, what is your experience in publishing as an author? And then a second part is kind of, how does that contrast with your role as an editor? So I'll speak to those briefly. One of the things, this is an experiment that I did, was writing for spoken presentation versus writing for publication. So when I have presented papers at conferences, I initially had a really kind of an academic sounding kind of presentation. And I kind of had an academic voice when I gave them. I didn't know how else to do it, so that's what I did. But then a few years ago, I experimented with what happens if you write a conference paper. Do it, first of all, as an academic paper, but then write it in a presentable form. And what I wanted to do was find out, can I do something that just sounds like me speaking, but actually presenting serious academic work, but it's in my natural voice. I haven't got too much text on the page, so I'm not speed reading, which is kind of what I'm doing now. I could take my time. I knew that I had this much material and I could just talk. I could look at people. So I did that. And it was an incredible experience, because I found out, yes, I can present an academic paper, but just do it in my own voice. But the liability, you're basically writing 2 papers. So it's not very economical. So it's far more economical to write for publication. And for those of you who are thinking about writing for publication, that should be your first priority. Don't do the paper or the presentation as kind of the scaled back colloquial kind of thing if you want to get it published, because it's so much more work later than to kind of ramp it up to publication level. You can do it, and you're probably going to work on it more anyways. If you do have enough time, though, I'd say write that full paper first and make sure all your footnotes are in it, all your bibliography is in it, have it like really ready to go. But if you have time and you can write it kind of in a different form that's really your own voice, it's a pretty cool thing to find out you can do it in 2 totally different ways. And it may actually be part of helping you to find your own voice for all of your academic writing, because you may realize, I can do something that sounds a lot more friendly and warm and still be doing first-rate scholarship. So that's a challenge I set myself, and one of the things I learned as an author. Another thing about being an author, early on, I was pretty defensive about editorial changes. So if an editor, like say a copy editor, has taken a look, worked through your manuscript and sends it back to you, and they got all these things change, and you need to change this and alter that, and that doesn't make sense or whatever, I felt pretty defensive about that. And I really wanted to say, hey, you know what? I think I did a pretty good job. I think actually this belongs here. But I realized you can't do that. And to tell you the truth, by now, I'm much more inclined to just go with the flow. If there's something technical that where it creates something is now incorrect by that change, or there's something like the editor may not have specialist knowledge in your area of research. So they may be saying you should do something and it actually goes totally against the discipline or whatever. You gotta fight for that. But otherwise, I mostly just say, okay, that's fine. They're skilled, they're trained, they're knowledgeable. And so if they see something that's not making sense or should be streamlined in a different way, I go with it and then just save those kind of critical pieces. So then how does my role as an editor differ from that of the author, and how do they inform each other? First of all, there are lots of different kinds of editors. So the word is the same, but it means lots of different things. An editor of a series is probably going to oversee the process of books being accepted or not into the series, and the process of transforming them from submitted manuscript to published book. But there are varying degrees of how much hands-on actual editing they do. They may do a lot, or in some cases, other people may do more of the actual editing work. And when I say actual, I mean, they're all editing, but they're different levels of editing. And when you see editors on a book, sometimes one editor is the one who's really done most of the work, and maybe one lead editor is there because that's the way they're going to sell the book. The lead editor's name is first. People know that name. They want to buy the book because so-and-so famous guy edited it. But Joe Schmuck over here is actually the one who did all the work to put the book into the shape. And that's just part of the process. So if you're a junior editor, you're probably going to do more work than the senior editor, but not always. Some senior editors are very hands-on as well. Experience in editing, I think, really impacts your work as an author. So I have quite a bit of an experience as an editor. For about 10 years, I worked for an academic press as a freelance proofreader, copy editor, typesetter. So I handled about 40 volumes and journals in a wide range of studies: biblical, ancient rhetoric, ancient history, Greek language and linguistics, musical studies. So I've worked on all these different materials, making them into publishable works. And sometimes it was typesetting back in the day when we used that word, camera ready copy, making PDFs. I would do detailed copy editing, going through a manuscript and cleaning up all of the typos and the inconsistencies, handling different proofs. You go back and then the author responds back in the day when you mailed things and received them back. And then on computer, author correspondence, all kinds of things like that. And then for another couple of years, I worked as a project manager for several consolidated academic presses. And so that used all that previous experience, but now I really just manage the whole production thing myself. And so I did it all: copy editing, talking with the authors, setting up the work to be published, like actually doing the work, what it's going to look like on the page, how many words are on that page, what that footnote looks like. So it's pretty technical, pretty detailed. But as you can imagine, I have a lot of experience in helping other people to get a book to publish for them. I can do a better job of getting my own books to publish for them too. And so, well, one thing I learned is that some really well-known scholars can be really sloppy writers and pay no attention to details. So sometimes, you hear a name like, oh, wow, so-and-so, famous person. Those of us who worked on their works like, yeah, well, it's good because we made it good. But one of the things about doing this kind of editing is that these days, all of this editing, even when I was doing it, all of this editing can be done from wherever you are. So it's a great idea to see if you can work for a publisher somewhere remotely and do some of the work of editing, if you have any inclination at all in that kind of field. First of all, it's a job, and a lot of people need multiple avenues when it comes to professional academic work. So academics don't always get full teaching jobs. Sometimes being in the publishing industry is really important. But the more experience you get doing that kind of work, the easier it is for you to apply it to your own work and really create clean manuscripts and just develop by learning what others have done. I'm going to say something about series here, and then I'm going to come back to that. So a number of years ago, Stan and I worked for quite a few years, actually, to edit a lot of New Testament Greek language papyri. And we visited most of the major collections in the world that have New Testament or other ancient papyri. And we personally re-edited and published new editions of all the New Testament papyri in the Austrian National Library in Vienna, Austria. Some of you know all about that already. It's work that was pretty exciting in some ways, but tedious in others. And then when it came time to publish these volumes, they were already pre-designed to go in a particular series with De Gruyter. We did all the setting up of these ourselves. And that's partly because we have the knowledge to do that kind of technical work. And because the research is really technical, we didn't really want to hand it over to somebody else to be doing it. So I'll just show you one of the two volumes there. You won't be able to see the words, but so it's called New Testament Greek Papyri and Parchments. 2 volumes. One is kind of a little bigger, one's a little narrower. It has more of the actual photographs in it of these papyri. And then in it, we did what are called diplomatic and reading texts. So you can see, you can't see, but I mean, you can trust that I'm telling you that there's Greek text here. And these are our editions of manuscripts that we would basically held in our hands. And so we would say, you know, here is what we see on this line, and there are things missing here. So it's highly technical. And so these books are in a series that is highly technical and designed for highly technical academics. So that's great. But not all books are designed to be highly technical, and they may not be aimed at that kind of an audience. They're aimed at a broader audience, right? So in this case, being an author and editor also worked hand in hand for me in something like a conference we had a number of years ago that was focused on worship. So in that case, I was part of planning and designing the conference, as well as editing the volume that came out of it. And so it was a combination of various people presenting different aspects about worship, biblical presentations, and as well as people responding to as practitioners. So I helped to arrange that, but then I also helped to make the book look like that as well. So as an author, I was also one of the presenters. As an author, I could think it through as a reader and as a participant, but as an editor, I had the opportunity to shape a book in a particular way. I'd never really seen a book done quite like that. So I suggested we do it as the conference. I suggested we do it as the book. And so that allowed me to do that. So that book would not fit with De Gruyter. That book definitely would not fit with De Gruyter, because De Gruyter isn't doing that kind of a book. So in this case, the book is in a kind of a published format that is available to the average person. It could be a theologian, it could be a worship pastor, it could be some other pastoral theologian, it could just be a general interest. It's not very expensive, it's paperback, you can get it easily. And so that book fits somewhere else. So some of what I'm going to talk about later has to do with that, where books fit. And that's especially has to do with this series that we're starting here. So now, Dale, I've come to the end of the 1A and B.
Okay. So you've kind of talked about starting the series. So for those that don't know, MDC is starting a practical theology series. And so the next question is, can you explain the impetus behind the creation of this series, and what are its goals and purposes?
Yeah, for sure. So let me back up again. So books need to fit in a series. Usually, in most cases, if you want to publish a book with a particular publisher, your book manuscript needs to fit in a series that they already have available. So if the publisher has developed an audience that's interested in a particular series, then they want books that fit in it. One-off books are harder for them to market. So if you got a book and they think it's interesting, but it doesn't fit with a series they've already got, usually they're going to say, I don't think we can do that one. That isn't going to fit. So MDC Press has several series: biblical studies, theological studies, ministry studies, general studies, New Testament studies, and linguistic exegesis of the New Testament. And a manuscript that focuses on practical theology could realistically fit in several of those, right? It could fit in theology, depending on what the focus of your book is. It could fit in ministry studies, or maybe more a general one. But practical theology is an area that is really growing and developing in various parts of the world, North America now, originally in Britain and Australia and elsewhere. And MDC is part of growing and developing that whole field, especially through our focused work on practical theology in the DPT program. So some manuscripts, as I say, might fit in these other areas, but having a series that actually has the term practical theology in it is a really obvious way of creating space for a particular kind of research and writing. So in some ways, creating a series can be seen as an act of hospitality for researchers and writers who need a place to publish their work, or also a way to find other people's work that's kind of already gathered together under that rubric or title or umbrella, whatever we want to call it. So so the studies in practical theology is just an obvious place for scholars who are working in practical theology or pastoral theology to locate their book. And so that's why I was saying before that you want to find a place where your book fits. We would not want these books that Stan and I did with DeGroote. We would not want them in this series. They don't fit. But Rediscovering Worship maybe would sort of fit, but for sure works that are being done in the DPT program would fit. And you need a place for it to fit. Sometimes a manuscript does not get published simply because the publisher doesn't have a series where it fits. And if you already know that your manuscript could kind of fit in a series that they have, that's a good thing for you to know, because you can say, I've got this manuscript that I think is pretty good. And, I noticed you've got this series on such and such. I've got a manuscript that looks like it could fit right there. And that is kind of like an open door to be able to get your book published. Oops, what am I doing here? So I've already said that books need an appropriate publisher. Practical theology or pastoral theology, essentially those, different people have done different kind of descriptions of what they are, but really they're two terms that essentially refer to a very similar thing. One largely developed and used in Britain, one developed and used in the US. When I first became familiar with it, we referred to it as practical theology when I was doing work in Britain. It's a broad area. It's got relevance for a lot of people, scholars and practitioners in a lot of areas. And MDC is at the forefront of research into practice in our DPT degree. So it's a kind of research that we really kind of fostered here in North America and when we introduced the DPT. So now, because we've already had a few graduates and we are clearly having a few more, congratulations to our newest doctorate here in the room. It seemed appropriate to then actually create a venue where more of that work could potentially end up. Nothing says it needs to end up here, but it's just one more opportunity to consider. But here's one other little thing, and that is the word count for published books. Now, I told you it's kind of coming down as far as, what is the amount of words that an average book is. It used to be bigger, or at least it could be. Now, publishers are usually looking for slightly smaller books. They can sell them for less money. It's less work to create them. But there still are minimal word counts that are important to keep in mind. And this is really important for each of you. For many publishers, probably 60,000 words is the minimal amount. So in light of this, you will notice that students in the DPT are to write their dissertation in the range of 40,000 to 60,000 words. So the upper range of possible word count in a DPT dissertation also makes it attractive as a possible book length. If you're in the PhD program, you've got more room to build your manuscript, and that would actually fit very well with many publishers as well. I'm not sure we have an upper range in the PhD, but probably there are at least 80,000, and that is a really good fit for a book as well. So what we've done is we've shaped what the DPT requires to allow you to kind of access that sort of minimal level of space for a book. So now you might think, well, how big is a book of 60,000 words? Well, every publisher uses a different font, different size, spaces the page in a different way. Maybe the lines are closer together. So they all vary in terms of how many words are on the page. But if there are approximately 450 words per page, which would be like the volume I did with Routledge. So my book, I told you, is 110,000 words. The book is 270 pages. All right. So I don't know if you can see the text, but so there you kind of get an idea of what the page looks like. I brought a book that I think many of you will be familiar with. It's not an exact fit, but this is Henri Nouwen's book called Reaching Out. And I think many of you have used it, or some of you have used it, The Three Movements of Spiritual Life. I have used it. It was significant in my life, and I still draw on it many times. It does not have nearly as many words on the page. So this publisher chooses to do things in a different way. It has about 315 words per page, and the book is 165 pages long. And it is approximately, I did this on the basis of figuring out one page, about 52,000 words. Okay, so now you have a little bit of an idea. It's not a massive book, It doesn't have tons and tons of text on the page, but it is a significant book. And if you've used Nouwen's book, you know it's meaningful. So there's nothing about 52,000 words that says you can't write a meaningful book, but it kind of gives you an idea of what you'd be looking at if you're doing a DBT, maximal amount of a book, or if you're in the PhD, then you're looking at something that's more like the other one that I was showing you. So that's kind of what I wanted to say, Dale, about that particular thing to do with MDC Press.
Great, that's great. So the third question, can you share with us the process of how a student would transform their existing dissertation work into a publishable tome for this series? I know you mentioned 60K. They might have changed that. Mine says 30 to 50 in mine, but
it has been changed. That's why I'm noting it has been changed, been moved upwards, partly so that if a DPT student wants to aim for that kind of publishable amount, it's actually built in. Otherwise, you may get stuck with, you got to write another chapter for your book to even be accepted at a publisher. And suddenly you got a chapter that doesn't look anything like the rest because you don't have all that process. So we've kind of eased you into this to give you a good way to be in the publishable range.
Sure. Sorry. And so at the question, how would we transform our existing dissertation into something that's publishable? Because I don't think it's going to be publishable just transferring it over. It's obviously some work's got to be done on it. So
good. Yeah. And you said initially a publishable tome. I love the fact that you use that word because I'm going to say we can't use a tome. So probably your book will not be called a tome anytime soon. And probably it's not going to be called a magnum opus either, but nor should you keep thinking of it as a dissertation. So the first job is to change your mindset and your vocabulary. Go through your manuscript and remove any mention of dissertation. Use book in most cases or a similar word. Publishers don't want work that is obviously student work, and dissertation signals student work. So even if your student work is absolutely brilliant, dissertation still is not the word you want to use. So just take it out. And that will help you to rethink your manuscript as well. You'll be thinking, okay, this is a book. I have a book. This is a book in my hands here or on my laptop, whatever. But so then how do you move from dissertation to publication? I would say you could actually write your dissertation like a book from the start, rather than just going from a cold start, like, okay, this is dissertation now. How do I make a book? Why not, if you still are in the process, why not be thinking, my dissertation is a book. So why don't I write it like a book? I mean, that's not going to change much. It's really mostly just a frame of mind that's going to make a difference to that. There will be a few things, and I'll mention some of those, but at least you're already thinking this is a book. Make it interesting. One of the key distinctives about a book is that it should be interesting enough for the reader to want to buy the book or check it out from a library or find it online. Interesting work draws a reader to it. Unfortunately, there is nothing in the description of a DPT or PhD dissertation that requires that it be interesting. Okay, so technically you can write a boring dissertation and you can pass. You can get a doctoral degree with a boring dissertation, but you may not be able to make it as a published book if it's really boring. So your supervisors and external examiner may pass it because it technically fulfills the requirements, but you don't want them to remember it as the most boring dissertation they ever passed too, right? So why not make it interesting? Now, I don't mean, add a bunch of jokes or, colorful stories, but have in mind, I'll say something about audience later, or maybe I'll just say it now. Have in mind who you think you want to reach with your dissertation. Who is the audience that you think is interested in your work? And maybe, fellow practitioners in the kind of work you do. So have them in mind as you're writing. I mean, yes, you got to do the technical stuff. You got to put the arguments together. You got to have your methodology in place. You got to make it fit through the hoops, but have in mind who you want to reach and write it in a way that they're going to want to read it, so that you're already kind of moving in that direction. And there's nobody has ever failed a dissertation because their work was too interesting. Never. And nobody's ever missed out on publishing a book just because it was too interesting. So there are plenty of boring books out there. Yours does not need to be one. Just make it interesting. Do what you can to, and because you're interested in your topic, I'm assuming you are, or at least you were when you began, maybe you've kind of lost interest. You're interested in it. Write as though you're interested in it. Be engaged in it. Be excited as I'm projecting here now. be excited about it and write like you care about it, and other people will care about it too. So that's really critical for a book. Now, literature surveys are one kind of liability. Most research projects doctoral projects require a literature survey. And these are usually considered kind of boring when it comes to publishing for a book. So think about it in different ways. One is when it's time to move from dissertation to book, maybe think about moving, if you have a whole chapter that's just the literature survey, maybe think about moving it to the end in an appendix. It's still there, people can still read it, but it doesn't get in the way of reading your other material. Or one of the things I try to have some of my students do, integrate your literature survey throughout your book. So that it's not like one whole chapter, just kind of like, whoa, we're just bogged down with all this stuff. If there's a section that, you're dealing on one kind of thing, maybe kind of survey who you're discussing there and, your responses to it, and then move on to that topic in your chapter. So then it reads more like a book. Another thing I would say is use active voice wherever you can instead of using a passive voice. So the more times you kind of talk about something that was done to somebody or something that was done to something, it's a roundabout way of speaking, and it really can become confusing. It's hard to keep all the passive voices lined up in a way that makes sense. So use an active voice. Say, I did it. We did this. So-and-so did this. Find ways to just be more direct, and it's just a more kind of way of communicating directly with your reader or your listener, your conversation partner, whoever. As soon as you take out all the passive, suddenly your writing sounds fresh and interesting. And I mean, maybe not if your topic is really dull and boring, but otherwise probably will. Check for road bumps in your writing. And this is a term I use because it's kind of visually kind of reminds me. Probably the best way is to ask somebody else to read something you've written, not maybe a whole thing, but read, if there's something where you're not sure how it's communicating, have them circle or mark every place in that section, paragraph, chapter, whatever, where they're just not quite sure what you've said. They realize, I got to go back and read that again. I'm just not really sure. Those are what I call road bumps. And you know what it's like to drive on a road that has a bunch of speed bumps every few feet. It is really annoying. So road bumps in writing is really annoying because you got to stop and slow down and go back and try to figure out what was the person meaning here? Like, what is this? So all of us do that, no matter what level of writer. Professional writers will occasionally say things in awkward or confusing ways. But really good writers look for people to help them, or they themselves try to find where are those road bumps, and then they rewrite that section until it no longer causes any problem. That will help your readers. It's also even going to help you pass your dissertation. If your external examiner doesn't have to say, what in the heck is this person talking about here? But they're like, oh, I see. That's good for you. And that's good for you in preparing a book. Another thing is have a clean manuscript and view the MDC style guide as your friend. Okay, so I know most everybody thinks the MDC style guide is their enemy, but think of it as your friend. Presentation details are really critical in getting a manuscript accepted for publication. And no publisher wants a manuscript that's got obvious technical errors all through it. In fact, it's easier to pass your dissertation if there are no technical errors too. So use the MDC style guide, at least for anything related to our location, to help you to prepare a manuscript that's consistent. And consistency is like one of the key words for publication. Consistency in how you do the footnoting, consistency in how your bibliography is presented, consistency in how you use punctuation. Like you've learned that MDC style now uses the Oxford serial, the comma that goes right before and. How many student papers have I read that have them sometimes and not others? Just get used to putting it in so it's always consistent. So you're looking for consistency. That's one of the really key things about a house style or a style guide. So even though it's a pain to figure it out, get it right, and then just use it. Inconsistencies and typos in a manuscript are really like flashing red lights that kind of draw you away from the content, and they can really undermine your work, even if the work is really good. So kind of just eliminate all the distractions and leave that really good work for people to be able to attend to. So the style guide really applies significantly to footnotes and bibliography. I mentioned them already. Let me just tell you, this is a little insider view. I normally review a manuscript, including dissertation proposals and student papers, by starting with the bibliography and the footnotes. I don't know that many people that do that, but that's where I begin. It tells me a whole lot about the author. It tells me a whole lot about their ability to pay attention to details. And it gives me a very good kind of overview of who they are drawing on to inform their work. So if I read if you paid a lot of attention to your paragraphs and your footnotes are a mess, I'm like, okay, well, here we go. And so often I think, I wonder how the content's going to be. And quite often the forecast from the bibliography and the footnotes is played out in the content. It's kind of messy, kind of just not that great. So work on all those things, make them clean. If you've ever received work from me and I've given you all sorts of detailed notes on that, take those notes. I'm giving you free help, and then just keep doing it that way. So back to who's your audience. If you want to write a dissertation, a book for pastors, when it comes time to publishing your work, you want to publish it with a press that pastors want to go to, right? If you're publishing high-level scholarship that's technical, you want to find a publisher that's going to get to the audience that you want, and you want your writing of it to be that kind of writing. So you may write in different ways for different audiences, right? So how we wrote in these volumes on Greek papyri is not how I would write a book in any kind of a pastoral theology or practical theology subject, not at all. So you sometimes have to shape your writing according to who your audience is. Let me say something about your book title. Your title is important, and that's whether it's a book, a journal article, a chapter, or even your dissertation. So here are some clues for you. Don't hide the content of your book behind a clever first phrase, at least if that means that the real subject matter is in the subtitle. And why is that? There are probably multiple reasons, but one is because when your book title gets shortened, as it will in every electronic resource and in every footnote in a book, if people can't figure out what the book is about from the first few words, they're going to skip past your title and go to one that sounds more like what they're looking for. So say what the book or article is about in the first phrase. And it can take a lot of work to kind of come up with what that is, how to do that. But say it in the first phrase so that when you've got just that short title, people know, oh, this is a book about such and such. This is a paper about such and such. And try to keep your title to 12 words or fewer. 12 words or fewer. And that's for anything. Conference papers, journal articles, chapters, books, and dissertations, which have notoriously long titles. But so I'm saying all this, I've looked through the titles of some of my works, and I can tell you that I really did not fully understand this early on. I have some titles that are way too long, and I've got some titles that give no clue to the content in the phrase, the opening phrase. It's clever, but it says nothing. Nobody knows what it's about. So I try not to make those mistakes anymore, and you can try not to make them at all. And so you can avoid those. But here's a different aspect about your book title. When it comes time to publishing your book with a press, the publisher may want to change the title of your book. Now, sometimes you've invested a lot in it, right? You're like, okay, this is my title. It's like I've crafted it, I've shaped it, and I've done this. I know you can spend a lot of time working on your title. There are many ways to reshape a title. The publisher may come back with several suggestions. And so on the book that I published with Routledge, they said, we would like to propose a different title. You know, we've come up with several possible things. What would you, and the managing editor was very gracious, obviously trying to not say, we think your title is terrible, but we think this might be better. And I looked at them and I'm like, yes, I agree. And so we talked about them. And I said, I think this is probably the one that works best. They said, we agree. So I have a different title than I originally had, and it is much better. There's no question. It is a much better title. And so don't think that just because you invested time in working on that title, that there might not be a better choice. And the publishers may have better ideas about that. Part of the process of going from dissertation to publication is peer review. And all I always say about that is you got to be patient. You can't shorten it. You can't bypass it. You can't coerce it. You can't manipulate it. You can't give a bribe and get a better result. You just got to wait, settle in and wait. I would say ideally be working on another project. start another book, or at least a paper. So you got something else to focus your mind on while you wait. Because it can all really be slow work. Finding a publisher can be slow work. Ethically, you can only submit a manuscript to one publisher at a time. So already you can see this is way slow because editors, peer reviewers, other people working in with presses often are doing this over and above their regular work. They may be full-time academics or have full-time other jobs or have 2 or 3 jobs. And this is something they do on the side or on top. So they're trying to squeeze it into their lives. So they may not be working nearly as fast as you'd like them to be. Well, for sure, they're not working as fast as you'd like them to be. They're fitting it in where they can fit it in. So you have to wait. And so it is slow, and sometimes it doesn't work out as well as you want. Sometimes you're going to get a rejection saying, we're sorry, this doesn't really fit with our press, or maybe there's some criticisms of the manuscript. Take them, accept them, thank them for their work, move on to the next one. If your manuscript is accepted for publication, then oddly enough, there's no more time to wait. Now you got to jump into high gear. The review process may require that you change some things, and you should take those seriously. Don't get defensive about your manuscript. The most important thing is that you want to get it into print. So if the reviewer process comes through and says that, you know, we need you to change this and add this, and you didn't cite so-and-so, which really should be in there, okay, do it to the best of your ability. Maybe you can't do it exactly the way they require, but do the best you can. Just do it. And then the actual publication can be very slow as well. Again, you got to wait a long time for things. But here's a really weird thing about publishing, and it's not fair, but it's the way it is. So while you wait for the publishing people to do it, you just have to wait. And you wait and you wait. But when they send you an email and they've got something for you to edit or proofread or whatever, they expect you to do it now. I don't mean, you know, a week from now. I mean now. Often they'll say, well, you know, you have 2 days to do it. And we're like, how can I do it in 2 days, right? And then you do that, you send it in, and then you wait, right? You're like, what are they doing anyways, right? And then they finally send you something, and then they expect you to do it now. So it's not fair. It doesn't work well. It's chaotic. And I mentioned something about this later if I get time. I'm not going to get time to go. But it is just the way of publishing. So kind of expect it, realize that it's going to be inconvenient to do all of these things when they want you to do it. But all of the people that you've seen who have published books, all of the faculty at MDC who have books that you can see post, you know, hanging up on the walls or whatever, they all know what this is like. It's like, wait, and then kaboom, you're supposed to do it, and you just do it. And it always is going to happen when you don't have any time, right? It's going to be right when you are the most busy. I had student work, supervision work, grading of a large class, and I got the full manuscript that I was supposed to turn around, and I was supposed to get it done just after Christmas. I'm like, come on. But I did it. I got it in before it was due. So you can do it. It's hard work, but you can do it. And you should also remember that you'll never have done this maybe, but you need to provide an index. Indexing is slow, and it can only be done at the very, very, very last, when every word is already locked onto a page. And so just realize it takes time, but it's actually one of the things that distinguishes good scholarly books is that there is an index. If you want to know anything about the details of indexing or other things to do with the technical stuff of publishing a book, you should really have Stan's book called Inking the Deal. It's easy enough to find, not very expensive. I think probably it's available on DTL, and it will give you real detailed things. Okay, so yeah, okay. All right, I'll say I'm done with that, Dale, sorry.
Sorry, I had to find my unmute button. No, that's great. So the fourth question, we're going to open up for questions afterwards. So, but the fourth question to you is, what are some common pitfalls that people make during the writing and publishing endeavors?
Yeah, sure. So one of the big pitfalls is just your own state of mind. And there's so many variations on that, of course, right? There are so many things that we can let consume us. Waiting for the perfect time, waiting for the perfect place to work, waiting till the rest of your life becomes less busy, which means you're never going to get it done. Fear of failure, fear of critique, fear of being judged, fear of rejection letters, fear of success. And we can come up with all sorts of excuses and procrastination and over rationalizations that probably always hide some kind of a psychological issue. So I would say one of the things is do the work. It's going to probably mean sitting down and just being quiet for a while. Do the work of figuring out what it is that is keeping you from moving from dissertation to publication, because it can be a big leap, or a big, more like pit that you fall into, and you just cannot kind of rise up to do it. So try to figure out if there's anything that's preventing you from doing it. Try to figure out what it is, why you've got to have your desk perfectly clean before you can work on it, or whatever it is. Do whatever you have to ignore it or beat it down or run past it so that you can get this work done, because you will not regret it if you can do it. But it's pretty powerful. You maybe don't value your work. You maybe don't really value it as a potential book. I would say try to change your orientation about that and think, okay, I've spent this however many years working on the degree, working on the dissertation research. Recognize that it's valuable. And even if, you go to one publisher and they say, well, we don't think so, another publisher is going to say, yes, this is the book we've been waiting for. So value it enough to actually pursue it. Actually do organize your materials in your life. I think one of the pitfalls is having so much disorganization, or just not having it organized in a way that allows us to keep working on this stuff. So you maybe need to organize a physical space. You may need to organize your schedule. You may need to organize your relationships. For sure, you're going to need the assistance of maybe people in your family or friends or colleagues to say, yeah, we're recognizing you need this amount of time on this day or these days, and we will honor that with you because we know you're trying to accomplish this. And then, of course, that puts good pressure on you to do it. And another really big pitfall is, you can think of it as eternal revisions, or otherwise known as perfectionism. It will keep you from ever producing a book or an article. At some point, you have to say, okay, this is the best I can do with this particular work. And if I want to get it published, I have to stop. So first of all, recognize your book is not the perfect book. We have one perfect book, and it's the Bible, and all the rest of them are not perfect. So it's not the perfect book. So you're free for it to not be perfect. So just accept that, do the best you can with it, and then go forward, and you'll be surprised at the outcome. And then one other thing is that a big pitfall is that it's kind of connected with, trying to organize things and having everything need to be perfect. Basically, you've got to expect there's going to be some chaos in the process. As I said, manuscripts come when you have no time, and it's going to be chaotic trying to get the thing done, and you're not going to know how you're going to do it, and still you're going to be able to do it. So a lot of them are kind of mental state of mind, and some of them are just kind of organizational sorts of things. The only other thing I wanted to mention earlier is figuring out what your author name is. It has nothing to do with pitfalls. It just was previous stuff. What is your author name? Think about it now, because once you get that first book published, that's really the name you're going to have from now on. And so if that's the form you want, great. But if you thought later, oh, I wish I hadn't used that form, now you got multiple names out there. So I thought about that early. I decided to follow the academic convention. Often you include a middle initial. So I do. But I also have work that is like albums, and on a contemporary albums of songs, you don't use a middle initial. So I have two forms of names in two different venues or realms of my life. But just decide what it's going to be. And if you have a name in two languages, like you have maybe a Canadian or English language name and a name in another language, think carefully about how you want that to be. Talk with your supervisor about what would be a good way to present that name that you can live with for all your other publications. And don't think you're only going to do one. You're not. You're going to do multiple publications. So think it through. What are you going to use for that can consistently be your reference name? Okay, Dale, I'm done.
Perfect. You don't mind taking some questions, right?
No, sure.
So what we want to do is, if you want to ask a question, is put your hand up and we'll do it that way. Just to make a point on what you said about the name, you also want to do a Google search on your name, see if there's anybody else already using it, so that way it
it's a shock how many of us think that we're the only ones with the name we have. My name used to be Wendy Swanson before I was married. I didn't know anybody named Wendy Swanson. I did a search one time. There were like a dozen of them in Canada. I'm like, what in the world? I've never met one before, but yeah. So
And some even publishing, right? Like maybe not
sure.
Wendy Swanson, but yeah. And I found writing the lit review a slog. So it's, can't imagine reading it. So if you have a question, if you want to raise your hand up.
Oh, that's your other response. That's funny.
Yeah. So if you want to raise your hand up, we can ask Dr. Porter some questions here. It's been very rewarding for us. And so I'm going to go to Carla. Carla's going to unmute herself and ask away.
Carla. I can't hear you.
No, we can't hear you, Carla.
Oh, no. Oh.
Maybe if you want to type it in chat, if you can, and then we can ask it for you, if that works.
Check the volume on your computer. Well, I guess it must be on already. Boo. Am I going to see it? I don't know.
You should, but
I'll see if it comes up, pops up.
Yeah. But I can read it if that works too. If anybody else has questions, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, we'll go to Beth while we're waiting for Carla to type, and Beth can ask her question.
Hey there, thanks so much. That was really helpful. So my question is about if your work sort of spans two areas. So like I wrote you were talking about the audience, right? So
yeah.
I wrote really wanting to reach the church in general, like laity and people not necessarily in academia, but I also want it to be accepted in academia. And so my question is, when it comes to publishing, do you try to write two different works, one more geared for laity and just the general Christian population out there, and then one more for higher scholarly work, or do you try to combine them into one, or how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think you want to try to make it two books, because for one thing, it's going to kind of look like you're double dipping, unless you really have that much material that is so different. But I think what you want to do is find a publisher that invites both sides of that. And some publishers are really good for that, and others are not as good, right? So not that I necessarily can tell you which one is which, but there are increasingly more, I would say, more books that are published in areas of pastoral and practical theology that are accessible. They are, they're not terribly difficult to read, but they are also designed for scholarly readers. So I think it's maybe not as far a reach as you're expecting. I haven't read your writing, so maybe I don't know. But I think that it's quite possible to find, I think maybe numerous publishers, to tell you the truth, where that would be a good fit. I think many publishers are looking for works that have that academic rigor, not just, too lightweight, unless you're really concerned that you are trying to reach people that will just never pick up a book with a footnote or something like that. But even there, a lot of publishers these days, it's not my favorite, but it is the way Routledge uses it. They use endnotes. So there's no footnote on the page, right? So if a footnote is kind of seen to be a hindrance, well, there are no footnotes there. So sometimes that's a factor too, just how a publisher sets up their book in a way that looks more appealing. So I don't know, does that answer your question in some way, or at least give you some hope that you could do this in one shot?
Yeah, I mean, that would be my dream, is do it in one.
I think
are there places you can go that give you sort of a map to know which publishers are more like us, like that, versus something else?
I don't know. Maybe somebody else here knows that. I don't know if there's a kind of a legend to the, a descriptive diagram of which publisher to go for this or that. I would be doubtful that there is, but there's certainly people that can speak to it. So I think, who's your supervisor?
Phil Zilla and Cindy Westfall.
Right. So I think between the two of them, they can give you some good ideas because they've worked, you know, they know your work. I think they could give you some really good ideas about where it could fit that would span both those areas. I definitely would work towards a single book, not
Yeah.
two.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to read Carla's,
Okay.
and then we'll go to Greg next. So she asks, how important are the reviews that you usually read on the back cover, and how do you go about collecting them?
So I would say the reviews on the back cover are completely irrelevant. Not everybody agrees, but I think that they are not helpful for a book because, for one thing, they date it, and 10 years from now, who cares what so and so thought about your book? We just really care about your book, right? So I mean, certain publishers require that you find them, or at least propose, and most publishers will do that. So you're going to have to come up with a list of people that you think might be able to fulfill this. They may or may not draw on them, but they want your ideas about that. But I mean, some scholars have spent their entire last 20 years of their careers mostly just writing blurbs on other people's books. I think of John Whitbread, who has potential to be a remarkable scholar and has done some really good work in the past, but mostly he's writing, introductions to books and blurbs for books. I wish he would just write his own work, right? But of course, he's willing to do it. He's accomplished, he can do it. So, and it's great to have that person writing that, saying, they think your book is good. But personally, I think scholarship should stand on its own, not be based on what 2 or 3 or 4 people said about it. So that's not probably very helpful because it's still going to be the case. Certain publishers require it. I do not think it's something that is that helpful or that good. People will look at it. So if you can get somebody on there whose name is familiar, then that could help you.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Sinclair.
Yes, Dr. Sinclair.
Okay.
Wow.
Thanks. I had a number of questions, but you answered them, Wendy, so thank you for a thorough presentation. But I did have one, and that is one more. And that is, I know a dissertation, as I've learned this week, is once it's approved, it's locked in and set. But I guess at some point you can take that material then, and you can, well, I'd love to improve it at this point. So in terms of publication, you're free, right, to take your dissertation material and then start tweaking it for that purpose.
For sure. Yes.
Is that correct?
So it's only locked in terms of your dissertation. It's going to be put in a bound form. It's going to show up in the library. And there's sort of a record of where it was at. But yes, this is not like you've already published a book and now you're trying to publish another book, so you can't change it. You absolutely can. And so, yes, you can tweak it, change it, but don't tweak it and change it so much that you never get it done and never get it somewhere, right? So don't get caught in that kind of vortex.
Okay, good.
But yeah, it's yours, it's your work, and you can now shape it to be the book you want and find a publisher to publish it.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Excellent. If anybody else has a question, you raise your hand. I have one question. You're mentioning during the editing process or during the writing process, actually, about getting people to read it. What about, made me think about, I use Grammarly a lot. I subscribe to the premium of Grammarly. What about programs like that help you hone your writing a little bit so that you're not doing some of the bad stuff, I guess, in writing?
Well, I think it's better to actually learn how to do it yourself. So, I mean, Grammarly can fix it for you. But I'm not sure that's the same as actually learning, okay, why is something being changed here, or even where is something being changed? So I think it's better if you can develop the skill of finding where are those things in your writing that need something to be changed, and why do they need to be changed. I can understand Grammarly provides a lot of help, but I don't know. I think it would be worth figuring out some of those things on your own so that you aren't kind of dependent on Grammarly. What if, somehow your internet's down and suddenly you're left to your own writing devices and what goes on, right? So, I don't know. I think it's best if you can develop it yourself, But that's not to say there isn't a lot to be gained from having a professional program like that do some help.
For sure. Thank you. Sean, you have your hand raised.
Yeah. So let's say Greg wanted to submit his dissertation now that it's been completed and he's sort of finished revisions. How would somebody go about submitting for publication with the MDC Press in the Practical Theology series?
You just go online and click on the McMaster Divinity College, go to MDC Press, and follow exactly the same procedure. You can submit it directly to John Lee, who's the managing editor. And if it's something that you want to put in the studies in practical theology, you can say that, or he may look at it and say, this is where it fits. So then it would kind of get directed that way. Or you could talk with me initially, but it still would technically probably go into him. So it just follows the same procedure. You make sure that you've figured out what are the conventions that are required, what is expected. You've already worked with the MDC style guide, so there shouldn't be much of that, which is a real bonus. And then submit it and see what happens. So just because we're MDC people doesn't necessarily guarantee that every manuscript coming in from MDC people will be published. So there is a recognition that this is serious press, and it is. So a book may, a dissertation may be published. That's not what I mean. A dissertation may be passed, but we may not think that it really fits as a book in the series. So we might say, sorry, but that's not to say that it wouldn't fit somewhere else. Okay, or that it shouldn't be or that there couldn't be a better fit somewhere else. So it's not a guarantee, but it's definitely something to consider submitting a manuscript for it. And we have good people, some very excellent people who can evaluate manuscripts and give some good responses on those. So they'll get a fair read. And if we can see our way to making them a book that could actually fit as a book, then there's a good chance it will go through.
Excellent, thank you. So if there's no other questions,
and the same slowness as I was saying about other things, you never know how fast it's going to go.
Yeah, hurry up and wait, right?
That's it.
So if nobody else has a question, I have one last one. What was the title of your book before they?
Oh, I don't even remember. I'd have to hunt through a bunch of pages, and that wouldn't be too convenient on this thing.
No, that's fine.
It wasn't radically different, but it just was not as good.
Right.
And so I could see that. I could recognize that I had worked hard on my title, but this was better. So it's good to have an open mind about it. Otherwise, you can be just really kind of like, they're changing something I wrote or whatever. But
sure,
people feel about a manuscript usually like they feel like it's their baby. Lots of people will use that kind of analogy, and it makes some sense. I mean, you've spent a lot of time with it, you've given birth to it, you think it's beautiful, or you at least hope it's beautiful. And the one thing you don't want is somebody to come along and say, it's not very beautiful, right? That really can but you have to be a bit resilient about that and just realize it's not your baby. It is a manuscript. It's probably not the only thing you're going to write. Hopefully it isn't. Hopefully you're going to write another thing. In fact, even start on it now so that you've already got that in process, and not everything about your whole life and self-worth and value is all resting on this one manuscript. It could take several years to get it published. So your work, you've spent time on this work, it's still going to be worthwhile in a couple of years. Scholarship, academic stuff is slow going. Not only the process, but even developing an academic reputation, it's slow. It's really slow to get a book out and then people to actually read it and start to maybe use it or cite it. Often that's been kind of like a 10-year cycle. So it doesn't have to be that long, but it can be before it's kind of, so meanwhile, you should be writing another book, because then that starts to amp up people noticing the first one. And that's how you build an academic and scholarly reputation, by having multiple things out there. Of course, my thing is that I've done so many things in so many different areas. It's hard to really develop one reputation when you explored so much. But anyways, the ideal is that you will do, actually, the ideal for an academic is to do 2 books in one area, so that helps to stabilize you as a leader in that field, and then maybe go to another area after that if you want.
Excellent. So I'd like to thank you for being here. You are going to be presenting a similar but expanded topic at the colloquy, which is coming up. So if anybody's interested in joining that, make sure the emails have been going out the past week or so. So sign up for that and make sure you're involved in that. We do have, so everybody give with your icons, or you want to have a round of applause to Dr. Porter. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for being here. I'm surprised how many people are here.
Oh, they didn't have to eat lunch, so we got more people. We have 2 more sessions coming up for the PT Guild this semester. On February 13th at 1 p.m. It's Dr. Sebastian Kim, who is the Robert Wiley Professor of Renewal and Public Life at Fuller Theological Seminary. And then on March 22nd at 1 as well, we are having Dr. John Switten, who's the Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Care at the University of Aberdeen, join us. So mark those on your calendars. I know that they go out in the emails, but mark those on your calendars and be prepared for that. Again, thank you, Dr. Wendy, and everybody for showing up tonight. I really appreciate it. God bless.
Great to see you all.